The night I learned that money couldn't buy safety was the same night a billionaire decided my life was worth protecting. I still remember the smell of antiseptic clinging to my scrubs as I stepped out of Mercy Memorial Hospital just after 11:30 p.m. My 12-hour shift had somehow stretched into 16, and every muscle in my body protested with each step across the nearly empty employee parking lot. The October air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter, and a cold drizzle had turned the asphalt into a mirror reflecting the yellow security lights overhead. I hugged my faded navy jacket tighter around my shoulders and searched for my old Honda Civic parked near the far corner where employees without seniority always ended up. At 27, my life was simple enough to fit inside that aging car. Student loans. Night shifts. Microwave dinners. Calls from my mother every Sunday reminding me to take care of myself. Nothing glamorous. Nothing extraordinary. I liked it that way. Hospitals taught you how fragile life could be, and ordinary days felt like gifts. My travel mug still held cold coffee from 6 hours earlier, but I lifted it anyway, hoping the familiar bitterness would keep me awake for the 20-minute drive home. The parking lot was unusually quiet. Even the distant highway sounded muted beneath the soft rhythm of rain tapping against windshields. Something about the silence felt different, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was instinct. Nurses learned to notice tiny changes before anyone else did. A patient's breathing. A monitor's rhythm. A family's expression. That same instinct slowed my steps before my mind understood the reason. I heard a car door close somewhere beyond the row of SUVs near the east exit. Then another. Low voices drifted through the rain, too distant to understand but calm enough that I told myself they were probably doctors leaving late or maintenance workers ending their shift. I kept walking, digging through my bag for my keys. They weren't where I expected. My fingers brushed a notebook, lip balm, receipts, and finally the small silver keychain my younger brother had given me before moving across the country. I smiled without thinking. That tiny distraction lasted only a second. A shadow crossed between two parked vehicles ahead of me. Someone moved quickly, almost disappearing before I could focus. I stopped. Maybe I imagined it. Fatigue played tricks on exhausted minds. I'd once spent an entire shift convinced my pager was vibrating when it wasn't even clipped to my pocket. I shook my head and forced myself forward. Halfway to my car, another sound reached me. Footsteps. Fast. Not running exactly, but urgent enough to raise every warning bell inside me. My heartbeat quickened. The employee safety seminar flashed through my memory. Stay aware. Keep your phone ready. Return inside if something feels wrong. I reached for my phone, but before I unlocked the screen, a man stumbled into view from between two black SUVs. Even beneath the dim parking lot lights, I could tell his expensive charcoal coat was soaked from the rain. His breathing looked uneven, his shoulders tense, and although I couldn't yet see his face clearly, there was something unmistakable in the way he carried himself. Not fear. Determination. As our eyes met across the rain-slick pavement, time seemed to pause, and for reasons I couldn't possibly understand in that moment, I realized my ordinary life had just ended. The man froze for only a heartbeat before his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made the cold rain disappear. They were a striking shade of steel blue, sharp and alert despite the exhaustion written across his face. He looked to be in his early 30s, tall enough that even with his shoulders slightly hunched he carried an unmistakable presence. Water dripped from his dark hair onto the collar of his tailored coat, and for one strange second I wondered why someone dressed like he had stepped into my quiet employee parking lot in the middle of the night. Then I noticed the way he pressed one hand firmly against his side beneath the fabric of his coat. My nursing instincts took over before common sense could stop them. "Are you all right?" I called, keeping enough distance to protect myself while trying to sound calm. He glanced over his shoulder instead of answering. The movement was quick, practiced, like someone who had spent years evaluating every possible exit. When he looked back at me, his expression softened just enough to reveal something I had not expected. Relief. You should leave, he said quietly. His voice was deep, controlled, carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Now. I should have listened. Every safety lecture, every instinct, every logical part of my brain told me to get into my car, lock the doors, and drive away. Instead, I took 2 cautious steps closer. You need medical attention, I said. I am a nurse. He let out a slow breath that almost sounded like reluctant amusement. That explains the look on your face. I frowned. What look? The one that sees a patient instead of a stranger. Before I could answer, headlights swept across the far end of the parking lot. The reflection danced across dozens of parked cars before disappearing again behind a concrete support column. The man immediately shifted his position, placing one of the larger sport utility vehicles between himself and the approaching light. His movements were deliberate, efficient, and oddly protective, as though he did not want me standing where I was. My pulse quickened. Something was very wrong, even if I could not yet define it. Please, I whispered. Sit down for 1 minute. Let me at least make sure you are okay. His eyes searched mine, studying me in complete silence. I had seen that look before in emergency rooms. It was the expression of people deciding whether they could trust the person standing in front of them. Finally he nodded once. I guided him toward the narrow space beside my Honda where the security lights barely reached. He leaned lightly against the passenger door while I opened my emergency supply pouch that I always carried in my work bag. Gauze, antiseptic wipes, gloves, adhesive tape. Every nurse I knew kept something similar close by. This is probably the first time someone has treated you in a parking lot, I joked softly, hoping to ease the tension. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth before disappearing almost instantly. You would be surprised. I carefully examined him without asking unnecessary questions. He remained remarkably composed, answering only what was needed, never volunteering anything about himself. His expensive wristwatch alone probably cost more than my yearly salary, yet there was nothing arrogant about him. Only quiet discipline. As I secured a fresh bandage, another pair of headlights appeared in the distance. This time they slowed as they entered the hospital entrance. The man's entire posture changed. He straightened immediately, every trace of fatigue hidden behind a calm expression. Then he looked directly into my eyes and spoke the words that would stay with me forever. Claire, he said, somehow knowing my name from the badge clipped to my jacket, whatever happens next, do not be afraid. The sound of approaching engines grew louder, but instead of panic, the man beside me became impossibly calm. His breathing slowed. His shoulders relaxed. It was as though he had flipped an invisible switch inside himself. 3 black sport utility vehicles rolled into the parking lot with silent precision before stopping several yards away. The doors opened almost at the same time. Men dressed in dark suits stepped out, scanning the area with disciplined movements before one of them hurried toward us. Sir, he said, stopping a respectful distance away. Relief washed over his face the instant he saw the man standing beside me. We have secured everything. The stranger gave a small nod but never took his eyes off me. Good. That single word carried quiet authority. No raised voice. No dramatic gestures. Yet every person around him reacted immediately, as though his calm mattered more than anyone else's urgency. I suddenly realized I had stepped into a world completely different from my own. One of the suited men glanced toward me with polite curiosity. Is she all right? He asked. The stranger answered before I could. She helped me. Nothing more. Nothing less. Somehow those 3 words seemed to change the atmosphere. The men looked at me differently after that. Not suspiciously. Respectfully. One of them even inclined his head in silent gratitude. I finished adjusting the fresh bandage beneath the stranger's coat and packed my supplies back into my worn medical pouch. You should still have this checked properly, I said, trying to sound like this was any ordinary patient. Even if you feel fine now. For the first time that night, he smiled completely. It transformed his face, softening the sharp lines that had made him seem untouchable only moments earlier. "You sound exactly like every nurse I have ever met." "That is because we usually know what we are talking about." A quiet laugh escaped him before he reached into the inside pocket of his coat. For a second I wondered whether he was searching for identification. Instead, he produced a simple white handkerchief embroidered with dark initials. He looked at it for a moment before folding it carefully and placing it back inside his pocket. "Thank you, Claire." Hearing my name spoken so naturally unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. "You are welcome," I answered. "But I still do not know yours." He hesitated just long enough to make me believe he might actually tell me. Instead, another suited man approached and whispered something into his ear. The stranger nodded once. Another time. Before turning away, he looked directly at me again. "Drive home carefully. Do not stop anywhere unless you have to. You make it sound like something bad is about to happen." "I hope I am wrong." He walked toward the waiting vehicles with the quiet confidence of someone carrying invisible responsibility on his shoulders. No one walked ahead of him. No one walked beside him. They naturally formed around him without being asked. Within seconds the convoy disappeared into the rainy night, leaving only the fading glow of red taillights reflecting across wet pavement. I stood alone beside my old Honda, wondering whether exhaustion had created the entire encounter inside my imagination. The parking lot felt ordinary again. Rain continued falling. A security officer crossed the entrance pushing a maintenance cart. Somewhere inside the hospital an ambulance siren echoed before fading into the distance. Life continued exactly as it always had. The drive home blurred together. I barely remembered stopping at traffic lights or pulling into my apartment complex. It was not until the following morning, while eating cereal in front of the television before another night shift, that the local news anchor interrupted the weather report with breaking news. A photograph filled the screen. The man from the parking lot stared back at me in a perfectly tailored navy suit beneath the headline that made my spoon slip from my hand. Ethan Blackwood, one of the youngest billionaires in America, had unexpectedly disappeared from a charity gala the previous evening after what reporters described only as a serious security incident. My heart stopped for a single impossible second as I realized I had treated the most talked about businessman in the country without having the slightest idea who he really was. I spent the entire drive back to Mercy Memorial trying to convince myself that the news story had nothing to do with me. Billionaires did not remember nurses they met for 5 minutes in a rainy parking lot. Men who owned companies worth billions of dollars certainly did not think about a woman whose greatest financial accomplishment was paying her rent on time. By the time I changed into fresh navy scrubs and clipped my identification badge onto my pocket, I had almost succeeded in forgetting the entire encounter. The emergency department was as busy as ever. Monitors chimed. Telephones rang. Stretchers rolled through automatic doors with practiced urgency. Familiar routine settled my thoughts. Patients did not care about headlines. They cared about kindness, steady hands, and someone willing to listen. For several hours, that was enough to push Ethan Blackwood completely out of my mind. Then just after 4 o'clock that afternoon, everything changed. A quiet ripple spread across the nurses' station before I even looked up. Conversations became softer. Security officers who rarely entered the treatment area suddenly stood a little straighter. I followed everyone's gaze toward the main entrance. 6 men in perfectly tailored dark suits walked inside with calm professionalism, not intimidating anyone, simply creating space. They moved like people who had rehearsed every step 1,000 times. Between them walked Ethan. This time he wore a perfectly fitted charcoal suit with a crisp white shirt and a dark blue tie. There was no sign of the exhausted stranger I had treated the night before. His posture was confident, his expression composed, and yet his steel blue eyes searched the room with quiet determination until they found me. My heart reacted before my mind did. "Claire Bennett," my charge nurse whispered beside me. "Do you know why Ethan Blackwood is walking directly toward you?" I slowly shook my head. Not even a little. Every conversation nearby faded into the background as he stopped a few feet away. Up close, he somehow seemed even taller beneath the bright hospital lights. He offered a polite smile that reached his eyes this time. "Good afternoon, Claire." I blinked. "Good afternoon." He glanced briefly at the patient charts in my hands before looking back at me. "I hope I am not interrupting your work. You are surprising everyone, but no, I have a few minutes." One of his associates quietly handed him a small white gift bag before stepping back again. Ethan extended it toward me. "This is simply a thank you." I hesitated. Hospital policy discouraged accepting expensive gifts from patients. "I cannot accept anything valuable." "Open it." Curious, I looked inside. Instead of jewelry or money, I found a handwritten thank you card and a small box containing gourmet herbal tea. Nothing extravagant. Just thoughtful. I looked up, unable to hide my surprise. "You remembered I said I drink too much coffee. You also looked exhausted." I laughed softly despite myself. Occupational hazard. For a brief moment, we stood there like two ordinary people having an ordinary conversation. Then his expression grew more serious. "Claire, there is something important I need to tell you." My smile faded. "What is it?" He lowered his voice just enough that only I could hear. "The people connected to last night may eventually learn that someone helped me before my security team arrived." My stomach tightened. "You think they would care about me?" I do not deal in guesses when someone else's safety is involved. I stared at him, searching for any sign that he might be exaggerating. I found none. His calm certainty unsettled me far more than panic ever could. He held my gaze for another long second before speaking the sentence that quietly changed everything. "From this moment forward, Claire, you are under my protection. Whether you believe you need it or not, I will make certain you are safe." For the rest of my shift, I tried to convince myself that Ethan Blackwood had simply been overly cautious. Hospitals were full of people who imagined worst-case scenarios after frightening experiences. Maybe billionaires did the same thing. By the time I finished checking medications, updating patient charts, and helping an elderly woman call her daughter, my heartbeat had finally settled into something normal again. Ethan and his security team had left quietly, leaving behind nothing but confused whispers from my coworkers. "Do you know him?" one nurse asked while we restocked supplies. "Not really," I answered honestly. "I met him yesterday." She stared at me as though I had said I met the president while buying groceries. "Only you, Claire." I laughed, but it sounded forced even to my own ears. When my shift finally ended shortly after 7 that evening, I changed into jeans and a cream-colored sweater before walking toward the employee parking lot. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and fresh. Everything looked completely ordinary. Nurses laughed near the entrance. A physician hurried toward his pickup truck while balancing 2 paper coffee cups. Someone across the street walked a golden retriever that seemed determined to sniff every tree. I almost smiled at myself for believing my life had somehow become extraordinary overnight. Then I reached my Honda. My driver's side mirror was folded inward. I frowned. I never left it that way. Assuming another car had accidentally bumped it, I unfolded the mirror and noticed a tiny scratch running across the glass. It was small enough that most people would never have noticed, but something about it unsettled me. I unlocked the car and climbed inside. Before starting the engine, I reached for my phone to call my mother, something I did whenever I felt uneasy. The screen remained black. I pressed the power button again. Nothing. The battery had been nearly full an hour earlier. Confused, I plugged it into the charger. Still nothing. "That is strange," I whispered to myself. I looked through my bag, wondering if I had somehow damaged it during work. Everything else was exactly where I had left it. My keys. My wallet. My notebook. Nothing appeared missing. Trying not to overthink it, I started the engine and pulled out of the parking space. 2 blocks later I noticed a black sport utility vehicle in my rearview mirror. That was not unusual. This was a busy city. At the next traffic light, it stopped behind me. When I turned right instead of continuing straight toward my apartment, it turned right as well. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. "Do not be ridiculous, Claire," I muttered. "Half the city drives black sport utility vehicles." I deliberately made another unexpected turn through a residential neighborhood. The vehicle followed. My pulse quickened. At the next intersection I circled an entire block before heading back toward the main road. The same headlights remained behind me. Every safety lesson from nursing school echoed through my thoughts. Do not drive home if you believe someone is following you. Go somewhere public. Stay where there are people. I took a slow breath and steered toward the nearest police substation instead of my apartment. The black vehicle continued behind me until I turned into the brightly lit parking lot. Then, without hesitation, it drove past the entrance and disappeared into evening traffic as though it had never been there at all. I sat motionless with both hands gripping the steering wheel. Maybe it had all been coincidence. Maybe exhaustion was making me paranoid. Yet deep inside, I remembered the certainty in Ethan's voice. He had not spoken like a man making a prediction. He had spoken like someone who already knew the danger had begun. I remained inside the police substation parking lot for nearly 20 minutes, watching every vehicle that entered and every pair of headlights that passed along the street. Nothing unusual happened. Officers came and went. Families reported minor accidents. A teenager nervously walked inside with his father after what looked like a fender bender. The world continued as though my fear existed only inside my imagination. Eventually I started my car again and drove home by a different route. I checked my mirrors far more often than I ever had before, but no black sport utility vehicle appeared behind me. My apartment building welcomed me with its familiar flickering hallway light and the faint smell of fresh laundry drifting from the basement. For the first time since meeting Ethan, I allowed myself to believe everything might still return to normal. I made chamomile tea using the small box he had given me at the hospital. The warmth settled my nerves almost immediately. I smiled despite myself. Somehow the billionaire who could probably buy half the city had remembered that an exhausted nurse needed less coffee and more sleep. The thought felt strangely human. My phone finally powered back on after several hours connected to the charger. I assumed the battery had somehow failed, but as the screen lit up, I noticed something odd. Every recent call was still there. Every message remained untouched. Only one thing had changed. A calendar reminder I had never created appeared for 9 o'clock the following morning. It contained only 3 words. Stay aware, Claire. I stared at the screen, convinced I had forgotten creating it during one of my sleep-deprived shifts. Yet something deep inside me insisted otherwise. Before I could think about it any longer, someone knocked gently on my apartment door. My heart immediately began pounding. It was almost 10:30 at night. Nobody visited me without calling first. I quietly stepped toward the peephole. Standing outside was Mrs. Henderson, my 70-year-old neighbor from across the hall, holding an empty pie dish with her usual cheerful smile. Relief washed over me so suddenly I almost laughed. I opened the door. "You scared me." "I am sorry, dear," she said warmly. "I borrowed your casserole dish last week and finally remembered to return it." We talked for a few minutes about the weather, her grandchildren, and the noisy plumbing that never seemed to get repaired. Ordinary conversation had never felt so comforting. After she returned to her apartment, I locked my door and checked it twice before finally going to bed. Sleep came slowly. Every small sound outside the building seemed louder than usual. Around 6 the next morning I woke to the low hum of engines outside my bedroom window. Pulling the curtain aside, I expected to see delivery trucks or construction workers. Instead, 2 unfamiliar black luxury sport utility vehicles were parked across the street. Men in dark suits stood nearby, speaking quietly while watching the entrance to my apartment building with calm professionalism. My stomach tightened until one of them looked up, noticed me at the window, and gave a small respectful nod instead of trying to hide. A moment later my phone rang. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. I answered cautiously. Hello? Good morning, Claire. I recognized Ethan's calm voice immediately. Before you panic, he said gently, the people outside are mine. They arrived 10 minutes ago because someone else was asking questions about your apartment building before sunrise. I promised you that you would not face this alone, and I do not make promises that I cannot keep. For several seconds I stood frozen beside the window with Ethan's words echoing through the quiet apartment. I looked outside again. The men across the street were not pretending to read newspapers or drink coffee like characters in old movies. They simply stood there, alert but respectful, blending into the morning as naturally as the delivery trucks and commuters beginning another workday. This is unbelievable, I whispered into the phone. I know, Ethan replied. Which is why I need you to trust me for the next few hours. I closed my eyes. Trust. It was a simple word that suddenly felt impossibly heavy. I had known this man for less than 48 hours. Yet somehow he already knew when someone had been asking about my apartment before sunrise. What exactly is happening? I asked. There was a brief silence before he answered. Someone is looking for the woman who stopped to help a stranger in a hospital parking lot. How could anyone even know that? Because people notice more than they should. His voice remained calm, never dramatic, never trying to frighten me. That almost made it more convincing. Claire, I am sending someone upstairs. He will introduce himself before you open the door. Pack enough clothes for a week. My heart skipped. A week? Hopefully less. You expect me to leave my apartment with people I have never met? I expect you to make the safest decision available. Before I could argue, someone knocked softly on my door. 3 slow knocks. Exactly as Ethan had predicted. That will be Daniel, he said. Former United States Secret Service. He has worked with me for 8 years. He is one of the few people I trust completely. I walked carefully toward the door and looked through the peephole. A man in his early 40s stood outside wearing a navy suit instead of black, his hands folded calmly in front of him. He looked more like a college professor than a security specialist. Miss Bennett, he said clearly without raising his voice. My name is Daniel Brooks. Mr. Blackwood asked me to escort you safely. You do not have to decide immediately. I will wait as long as you need. His patience surprised me. There was no pressure. No urgency. Only quiet professionalism. I opened the door halfway, leaving the security chain fastened. How do I know I can trust you? Daniel smiled kindly. You do not. Trust is earned. Mr. Blackwood knows that. He reached into his jacket very slowly and removed a small sealed envelope instead of an identification card. He asked me to give you this first. I accepted the envelope cautiously before closing the door again. Inside was a handwritten note in the same neat handwriting as the thank you card. Claire, if our positions were reversed, I would ask the same questions you are asking now. Do not come because I asked you to. Come because you deserve to feel safe. Ethan. I read the note twice before realizing my hands had stopped shaking. Nobody had spoken to me like that before. Not as someone helpless. As someone whose choice still mattered. 20 minutes later I zipped my old duffel bag closed. I packed practical clothes, comfortable shoes, my nursing textbooks, family photographs, and the little stuffed bear my younger brother had won for me at a county fair when we were children. My apartment suddenly looked strangely empty. I wondered when I would see it again. Daniel carried my bag downstairs while I locked the door one last time. Outside, the cool morning breeze carried the scent of fresh rain and blooming maple trees. As I climbed into the waiting vehicle, I glanced back at the apartment building that had been my entire world for 5 years. I had no idea where Ethan was taking me. I only knew that every mile separating me from my ordinary life felt like crossing an invisible line into a future I had never imagined. The drive lasted a little over 40 minutes, long enough for the city skyline to fade behind us and give way to quiet tree-lined roads where every property seemed hidden behind tall stone walls and wrought iron gates. Daniel never tried to fill the silence with unnecessary conversation. He answered every question I asked honestly, but never volunteered information that did not belong to him. That alone made me trust him a little more. When the vehicle finally slowed before a pair of towering black iron gates, they opened without hesitation. Beyond them stretched a long driveway bordered by ancient oak trees whose branches formed a canopy overhead. The estate appeared gradually through the morning mist, not like a palace designed to impress strangers, but like a place built to withstand decades of storms. Gray stone walls reflected the soft autumn sunlight, while perfectly trimmed gardens surrounded a home that somehow looked both elegant and unshakable. I had seen mansions in magazines before, but standing before one made them feel like photographs of another planet. As we stopped near the front entrance, a house manager greeted me with a warm smile instead of the formal expression I expected. "Welcome, Miss Bennett. We have prepared a room for you." Her kindness eased some of the tension I had carried since leaving my apartment. Inside, the house felt surprisingly peaceful. Sunlight poured through enormous windows. Fresh flowers stood on polished wooden tables. A fire crackled gently inside a stone fireplace despite the mild weather, filling the air with the comforting scent of cedar. There were security cameras, discreetly placed but impossible to miss once I noticed them. I counted several without even trying. Safety lived here alongside luxury. A young woman brought me tea and fresh fruit before quietly leaving me alone to settle in. My room overlooked a peaceful lake behind the estate where ducks drifted lazily across the water as though the outside world did not exist. Everything was beautiful, yet none of it felt like mine. My duffel bag resting beside a king-sized bed looked strangely out of place, reminding me how far I had traveled from my tiny apartment. I had just unpacked my nursing textbooks when someone knocked gently. Ethan stood outside the room wearing dark jeans and a light gray sweater instead of the tailored suits I had grown used to seeing. Without the jacket and tie, he looked less like a billionaire appearing on business magazine covers and more like an ordinary man who had finally managed to sleep. "May I come in?" he asked. I nodded. "It is your house." "Not this room," he answered with a faint smile. "For now, it is yours." That unexpected response caught me off guard. He looked around before noticing the family photographs I had placed on the dresser. His eyes rested briefly on the picture of my parents taken years before my father passed away. "Your family?" he asked quietly. "Yes." I smiled softly. "My favorite picture of them." He studied it for another moment before saying, "You are fortunate to have memories like that." There was no envy in his voice, only quiet sadness. "What about your family?" I asked carefully. His gaze shifted toward the lake outside the window. For several long seconds he did not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "Most of the people I loved are memories now." The room fell silent. I realized that beneath the confidence, the wealth, and the endless layers of protection stood a man carrying loneliness so familiar that I recognized it immediately. Hospitals had taught me to identify invisible pain long before patients admitted they were hurting. In that moment, I stopped seeing Ethan Blackwood as the billionaire who had turned my life upside down. I simply saw another human being who had learned to hide his scars behind extraordinary strength. The first evening passed more quietly than I expected. Nobody followed me through the hallways. Nobody treated me like a prisoner. If anything, everyone behaved as though I were an honored guest whose comfort mattered just as much as her safety. That unsettled me more than strict rules would have. I wandered through the library after dinner, running my fingers along shelves filled with novels, biographies, and medical journals that looked as though someone had actually read them instead of buying them for decoration. A soft voice interrupted my thoughts. "I had a feeling you would end up in here." I turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway with two steaming mugs. "Tea?" he asked. I smiled. You are determined to improve my caffeine habits. I consider it one of my better investments. I accepted the mug, and together we settled into two leather chairs facing the fireplace. The silence between us no longer felt awkward. It felt restful. Outside, rain tapped gently against the tall windows while the fire cast warm light across the room. For the first time in days, I noticed my shoulders beginning to relax. Ethan glanced toward the stack of medical journals beside me. You really miss work already. I do, I admitted. Being a nurse is not just my job. It reminds me that even small things matter. Holding someone's hand. Explaining a diagnosis in simple words. Sitting with a patient who does not want to be alone. He looked into the flames before speaking. Most people assume success changes what matters. Does it? I asked. He shook his head slowly. It only changes the size of the problems waiting for you every morning. There was no self-pity in his voice. Only honesty. I studied him for a long moment before saying, You carry everything by yourself, do not you? He looked surprised. Why would you think that? Because every time someone offers to help you, you change the subject. A quiet smile appeared on his face. That sounds like something a nurse would notice. Occupational hazard. He laughed. It was not loud or dramatic. Just a genuine laugh that seemed unfamiliar even to him. One of the house staff happened to walk past the open library door and paused for the briefest second before smiling to herself. Ethan noticed my curious expression. What? I asked. He looked almost embarrassed. Apparently I have not laughed in this room for a very long time. The answer stayed with me. Wealth had filled this house with priceless art, beautiful furniture, and every comfort imaginable, yet somehow laughter had become the rarest thing inside it. We spent another hour talking about ordinary subjects instead of danger. My favorite childhood camping trip. His first summer job mowing lawns before college. The embarrassing meals both of us had attempted to cook while living alone. Every story chipped away another layer of distance between us. At one point I caught myself forgetting that he was one of the richest men in America. He was simply Ethan, drinking tea that had already gone cold because he became too absorbed listening to someone else's stories. When I finally stood to leave, he walked me to the hallway. Claire. I turned. Thank you. For what? You spoke to me tonight like I was a person instead of a headline. I smiled gently. That is because headlines never tell you who someone really is. His expression softened in a way I had never seen before. As I walked back toward my room, I realized something unexpected had happened. I had arrived believing Ethan was protecting me from danger. I was beginning to wonder whether, without meaning to, I had started protecting something inside him that money, power, and success had never been able to reach. The next morning I woke to the comforting smell of fresh coffee drifting through the hallway, followed almost immediately by the realization that I was no longer waking up in my tiny apartment. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor as I opened the curtains overlooking the lake. For a few peaceful minutes, everything felt almost normal. Then my phone vibrated. The screen displayed my younger brother Ryan's name. Relief washed over me until I answered and heard only silence on the other end. Ryan? I asked. Are you there? A few seconds passed before the line disconnected. I called back immediately. Straight to voicemail. My stomach tightened. Ryan never ignored my calls. He lived nearly 300 miles away in Ohio, and we spoke at least twice a week. Even when he was busy, he always sent a quick text. I tried again. Nothing. Before panic could take over, another message appeared on my screen from an unfamiliar number. Your brother is safe. Keep it that way. There was no signature. No explanation. Just those 6 words. My hands began trembling so badly that I nearly dropped the phone. A soft knock sounded on my bedroom door. Ethan stepped inside after I quietly answered. The moment he saw my face, his expression changed. What happened? Without speaking, I handed him the phone. He read the message once before passing it to Daniel, who had entered behind him. Neither man looked surprised. Concerned, yes. Surprised, no. Somehow that frightened me even more. Ryan has nothing to do with any of this, I whispered. He is a high school history teacher. He has never even met you. Ethan looked directly into my eyes. That is exactly why this message was sent. What does that mean? Someone wants you to believe your family is vulnerable. My voice cracked despite every attempt to remain calm. I have to go to him. Claire. He is my brother. I know. Then you understand why I cannot stay here while he might be in danger. Ethan remained silent for several long seconds before speaking carefully. If you drive there alone, you may lead the wrong people directly to him. I hated that his logic made sense. It felt cruel because it was reasonable. I turned away, fighting the sting of helplessness. Nurses solved problems. We responded. We acted. Sitting inside a beautiful estate while worrying about my little brother felt unbearable. Ethan walked to the window beside me. When I was 24, he said quietly, someone once threatened a member of my family because they could not reach me directly. I looked at him. What happened? He stared across the lake before answering. I made the mistake of reacting emotionally instead of strategically. His voice remained calm, but I heard the regret beneath every word. I have spent years wishing I had made a different decision. He finally faced me again. I will not allow you to carry that same regret. Daniel stepped forward holding a tablet. Miss Bennett, we have already contacted local law enforcement near your brother's home through appropriate channels. We also have people discreetly confirming his safety without alarming him. Already? I asked. Daniel nodded. The moment the message appeared. Ethan had anticipated my reaction before I had even spoken it aloud. Less than 15 minutes later Daniel received a secure phone call. He listened quietly before handing the phone to Ethan. Ethan's shoulders relaxed for the first time that morning. He looked at me with a reassuring smile. Ryan is at school teaching his second period American history class exactly as he does every Thursday morning. He is safe. My knees nearly gave out with relief. Before I realized what I was doing, I covered my face with both hands. Ethan did not step closer or try to comfort me with empty promises. He simply stood beside me, giving me the space to breathe again. In that moment I understood something I had not seen before. His greatest strength was not the power to control people. It was the patience to protect them without ever taking away their dignity. That afternoon the atmosphere inside the estate shifted so subtly that I doubted anyone except a nurse would have noticed it. Conversations became shorter. Security personnel moved with slightly greater urgency. Daniel checked his phone more often than usual, though his calm expression never changed. Nobody spoke about danger, yet everyone seemed quietly preparing for something unseen. I found Ethan standing alone on the rear terrace overlooking the lake, his hands resting lightly against the stone railing as a cool breeze carried fallen leaves across the water. For several moments neither of us spoke. The silence between us had become comfortable, something I never imagined possible only a few days earlier. You have not slept much, I finally said. He smiled without turning around. You can tell? Your coffee is untouched. He glanced toward the mug beside him and laughed softly. I suppose I have become predictable. I stepped beside him, watching sunlight shimmer across the lake. Daniel said everyone is working on something. Ethan nodded once. We are very close to understanding who has been creating all of this fear. Does that mean it will finally be over? His answer came slowly. I hope so. Hope. Not certainty. Somehow I appreciated his honesty more than false reassurance. You know, I said quietly, most people think strength means pretending nothing scares you. He looked at me with genuine curiosity. And what do you think? I think real strength is admitting that something matters enough to make you afraid of losing it. His eyes held mine for a long moment before drifting toward the horizon again. You continue to surprise me, Claire. Before I could answer, Daniel appeared near the terrace entrance. He did not interrupt immediately. Instead, he waited until Ethan acknowledged him with a slight nod. Sir, Daniel said calmly, we have confirmation. The anonymous messages originated through several temporary devices, but our analysts connected them to someone inside a private contracting company that recently accepted outside payment to gather information. Ethan remained completely still. About Claire? Originally about you. She became part of their attention after the hospital parking lot. I felt my heartbeat quicken, but Daniel's composed tone somehow prevented panic from taking hold. Ethan asked only one question. Can they reach her? Daniel answered without hesitation. No. Every identified avenue has already been closed. Ethan released a quiet breath that sounded almost like relief. I realized then that while I had been struggling to trust his promises, he had already been acting on them every hour of every day. Later that evening, he asked me to join him in the library once more. A chessboard rested between us, though neither of us knew the game particularly well. We laughed more at our mistakes than our successes, turning what should have been a strategic contest into an excuse for conversation. Halfway through the game, Ethan leaned back and looked at the board before smiling. I believe you just defeated me. I blinked in surprise. I thought I was losing. So did I. We both laughed. The sound echoed through the library, warm enough that several members of the household smiled as they quietly passed by the open doorway. For the first time since arriving, the estate no longer felt like a fortress built against the world. It felt like a home rediscovering joy. As the evening grew late, Ethan carefully returned each chess piece to its place before looking at me with unusual seriousness. When this is over, he said, you will be free to return to your own life. I nodded, yet instead of relief, an unexpected sadness settled quietly inside my chest. Somewhere between shared cups of tea, long conversations, and ordinary moments protected from extraordinary circumstances, the distance between our two completely different worlds had become much smaller than either of us had intended. The following morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost unfamiliar. No urgent phone calls interrupted breakfast. No anonymous messages appeared on my screen. Even the security team seemed more relaxed as sunlight spilled across the gardens outside the dining room. It was the first ordinary morning I had experienced since meeting Ethan, and somehow that ordinary feeling carried more hope than any promise ever could. After breakfast, Daniel informed us that the investigation had reached its conclusion. The people responsible for gathering information had been identified through legal channels, their access had been cut off, and every credible concern involving me or my family had been resolved. He explained everything with the same calm professionalism he had shown since the day we met. There were no dramatic celebrations. Only quiet confirmation that the uncertainty was finally ending. When Daniel left the room, I looked across the table at Ethan. So this is it, I said softly. He nodded. This is it. Neither of us smiled. I had imagined this conversation many times while lying awake in the guest room, convincing myself that returning to my normal life was all I wanted. Yet now that the moment had arrived, my heart refused to celebrate. We spent the afternoon walking along the private trail circling the lake. Autumn leaves drifted gently onto the water, creating ripples that disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. Ethan walked beside me with his hands in his coat pockets, saying very little. Somehow silence had become our most honest language. Finally, I stopped near the small wooden dock where ducks floated peacefully beneath the afternoon sun. Can I ask you something? I said. Anything. Why did you really bring me here? He looked out across the lake before answering. Because I promised to keep you safe. I smiled gently. That is the official answer. He laughed quietly. You always know when I am avoiding the real one. I waited without speaking. After several long moments, he turned toward me with an expression I had never seen before. The confidence was still there, but it was no longer hiding vulnerability. The truth is, he said slowly, I told myself I was protecting the nurse who happened to help me in a parking lot. He paused, taking a slow breath. Somewhere along the way, I realized I was no longer protecting a witness. I was protecting the person whose presence made me remember who I wanted to be. My heartbeat seemed to echo louder than the breeze moving through the trees. He stepped a little closer, careful to leave enough space that I could choose whether to close the distance myself. Claire, before you came into my life, every decision I made was measured by risk, profit, or responsibility. You measured people differently. You reminded me that kindness is not weakness. That listening matters. That a home is not defined by walls or security systems. It is defined by the person who makes you want to return to it. I felt tears gathering despite my best effort to hold them back. You changed me too, I admitted. I spent my whole life believing extraordinary people lived in a different world from ordinary ones. Then I met you and discovered that loneliness sounds exactly the same no matter how much money someone has. A gentle smile appeared on Ethan's face. Without rushing the moment, he reached out his hand. I placed mine in his. It felt simple, natural, and more meaningful than any grand gesture could have been. Standing beside the quiet lake, surrounded by falling leaves and peaceful silence, I finally understood that real protection had never been about walls, cameras, or security teams. It had always been about finding the one person who made fear lose its power simply by standing beside you. 1 year later, my alarm still rang at 5:30 every morning. Some habits never changed, no matter how dramatically life did. I still tied my hair into the same simple ponytail before every shift at Mercy Memorial Hospital. I still carried extra pens in my scrub pocket because someone always needed one. I still smiled at nervous parents in the pediatric wing and reminded frightened children that they were stronger than they believed. The biggest difference waited outside when my shift ended. As I walked through the hospital entrance into the cool October afternoon, I spotted the familiar black sedan parked beneath the maple trees. It had become such a regular sight that even the security guards greeted the driver by name. Ethan leaned casually against the car, dressed in a navy overcoat with a paper coffee cup waiting in his hand. Long day? He asked as I reached him. I accepted the cup with a grateful smile. Very long. Thank you for remembering. You still prefer tea after work instead of coffee. I laughed softly. Some lessons stay with us forever. He opened the passenger door with the same quiet courtesy he had shown from the very beginning, never treating kindness as something too small to matter. As we prepared to leave, a little girl from the pediatric floor hurried outside holding her mother's hand. She recognized me immediately and waved with all the excitement only children possess. Miss Claire, she called. Is that your husband? I looked toward Ethan. He smiled with the same calm warmth that had slowly replaced the loneliness I first saw hidden behind his eyes. Yes, I answered, unable to stop smiling myself. He is. The little girl grinned. He looks like he keeps every promise. Her mother apologized for interrupting, but neither of us minded. After they left, Ethan remained unusually quiet while driving home. Finally he glanced at me and said, Children always seem to understand people better than adults do. Because they listen with their hearts first, I replied. The estate looked different now. It no longer felt like an enormous house protected by cameras and gates. It felt alive. Fresh flowers filled the kitchen. My nursing books rested beside Ethan's business reports in the library. Family photographs that once belonged only to me now stood beside new memories we had created together. Even the staff laughed more often than they had when I first arrived. Daniel liked to joke that the security systems had not changed, but the atmosphere certainly had. That evening we walked once more to the same wooden dock overlooking the peaceful lake where everything between us had finally become honest. Autumn leaves drifted gently across the water exactly as they had a year earlier. Ethan slipped his hand into mine without saying a word. He no longer needed to. I had spent so much of my life believing protection meant someone standing between you and danger. experience taught me something far more important. Real protection is waking up every morning knowing someone believes your life matters. It is being seen when you feel invisible. It is being respected even when you are afraid. Ethan could have filled our home with priceless treasures, but the greatest gift he ever gave me was something money could never purchase. He gave me peace. And perhaps the greatest gift I ever gave him was reminding him that the strongest people are not those who control the world around them. They are the ones who never allow power to silence compassion. Looking back now, I sometimes smile at the memory of an exhausted nurse crossing a rainy parking lot after a 16-hour shift. I thought I was simply helping a stranger for a few ordinary minutes. I never imagined that one quiet act of kindness would become the beginning of the safest place either of us would ever call home.